what if you could just take a snapshot of the entire planet on a single day? I mean, what kind of story would all the headlines actually tell? Well, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're looking at the news from just one 24-hour period, February 9th, 2026, to see what it tells us about the powerful forces shaping our world. So we've pulled together 15 key headlines from that one day. And at first glance, they might seem totally disconnected, right? You've got elections, court cases, drone strikes, even a Super Bowl halftime show. But trust me, together, they paint this fascinating and, yeah, often tense picture of our world. The big question is, what's the one global story they're all telling? All right, so first up, we're jumping into the high-stakes game of international relations. Think of it like a global chessboard. On this day, nations were busy making their moves, repositioning themselves, and testing just how strong their alliances really were. Check this out. On this one day, U.S. foreign policy showed two completely different faces. On one hand, you have cooperation. The U.S. signed this landmark nuclear deal with Armenia, which is a really clear strategic move to pull them away from Russia's influence. But then, on the other hand, you've got confrontation. At the exact same time, the U.S. is in these tense, arm's-length talks with Iran over their nuclear program. It's a perfect example of how complex this stuff is, a mix of reaching out and pushing back, all happening at once. And of course, the U.S. wasn't the only one making big moves. Over in Japan, a landslide election win cemented the prime minister's power. Meanwhile, in New Delhi, the expanded BRICS group, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and their new partners, was meeting, with China really trying to take a leadership role. And then, in Portugal, a presidential election was shifting their whole political landscape. See, every one of these is another piece in this giant shifting puzzle of global power. And sometimes, these big moves aren't about reaching out, but about tightening control. On this same day, the Israeli Security Cabinet made a really significant policy change in the West Bank. They approved new rules that basically make it much simpler for Israeli settlers to acquire land there. It's a very concrete step to assert more control in one of the world's most difficult and long-running conflicts. But, these top-down moves from governments, that's really only half the story, because on the very same day, you can see this powerful push coming from the ground up, this constant global struggle for justice, for accountability, and for basic human rights. 20 years. That's not just a number, it's a message. That's the prison sentence given to Jimmy Lai, a 78-year-old pro-democracy media owner in Hong Kong. It's the most severe sentence handed down under their new national security law, and it's seen around the world as this incredibly stark symbol of how the space for free speech and a free press is shrinking there. And you could see this tension between state power and individual rights playing out everywhere. In Tehran, security forces were arresting well-known reformist politicians, a clear move to quiet dissent. And then, you jumped halfway across the world to Minneapolis, where protesters were clashing with police, leading to 50 arrests at a demonstration over a fatal shooting by an immigration officer. You see, two totally different countries, two totally different situations, but it's the same fundamental dynamic: authority versus the people. And that fight for justice, it's also about demanding accountability from the most powerful people. On this day, there was a major development in the Jeffrey Epstein case. The Justice Department finally gave Congress access to the unredacted files. For so many people, this is a crucial step in a long, painful search for the truth and for justice for his victims. Okay, but behind all these political chess moves and legal battles, there's always a human price to pay. So now we're going to turn to the direct and honestly often brutal consequences that the day's events had on ordinary people's lives. 14 million. I mean, just try to wrap your head around that number for a second. That's how many people had been forced to flee their homes because of the conflict in Sudan. On this day, February 9th, 2026, it was officially the largest humanitarian disaster on the entire planet. Now, to understand what a crisis that massive really means on a daily basis, let's look at another number from that same day: 24. That's how many people were killed in just one single drone strike in Sudan. 8 of them were children. It's just a brutal reminder that that huge 14 million figure, it's made up of individual tragedies like this happening over and over again. Over in Ukraine, the human cost was being measured in degrees on a thermometer. With deaths from hypothermia rising because of attacks on the power grid, President Zelensky made this incredibly stark declaration, calling Russian energy infrastructure a legitimate target. I mean, that signals a huge escalation. It promises an even colder, harder, and more desperate phase of the war for civilians on both sides. And sometimes the crisis isn't even man-made. In Syria, a country already just shattered by years and years of war, nature itself delivered another devastating blow. Massive flash floods swept across the western part of the country, piling a natural disaster right on top of a human one. All right, for our final piece of the puzzle, let's look at how all these global tensions and triumphs show up in a place you might not always think to look: the cultural arena. From sports to music, our biggest stages often end up being mirrors that reflect the state of our world. So, amidst all this tension, you also have these incredible moments of cultural breakthrough. The Super Bowl halftime show is, without a doubt, one of the biggest platforms on earth. And on this day, Bad Bunny used it to make history, performing almost his entire set in Spanish. It was just a massive moment of representation, a celebration of culture on a truly global stage. But it's fascinating when you compare that to what was happening at another huge sporting event on the same day. At the Winter Olympics, athletes were using their press conferences not for celebration, but for protest, speaking out against U.S. immigration policies. So you have these two massive global stages being used in two totally different ways, one for a unifying cultural statement and the other as a platform for political dissent. So let's go back to our original question. What is the one global story these 15 headlines tell? Well, it really seems to be a story of constant tension. Tension between nations, tension between governments and their own citizens, between conflict and the hope for peace, and even between celebration and protest. Looking at just one day on Earth shows us a world that's being pulled in a dozen different directions at once. And that leaves us with the most important question of all. With all these forces in play, what kind of world are we actually building for tomorrow?